If your house has a flat roof, you are required by Torah to put a makeh, to put a guardrail around it to protect people from falling off the roof. A shul does not have that same obligation. The Beis Hamikdash does. The question is why? And of course, the Rabbi will teach us a magnificent lesson about how we reach out to others and have to be careful to have a guardrail when we do so. Over the pasuk in this week's parasha that says, if you build a new house, you have to make a guardrail around your roof. Shteit in Sifri says the Sifri bias, when the Torah says house, the Rabbi's heichal that comes to include the building inside the Beis Hamikdash, known as the heichal, that had to have a makeh guardrail around its roof. As the makeh ifengag from the Heichal Hamikdash is given, and in fact what the Sifri is telling us is that the guardrail around the Heichal's roof was nitna lenoi v'chayotze, but not as a decorative item nor a chiyuv mitzvahs makeh. It was obligatory, part of the fulfillment of the mitzvah of having a guardrail. If that's the case, is Yodur Dishaila, there's a well-known question. The din is, Allah tells us clearly, as Bate Knesses or Bate Midrashas, an impotter fun a makeh, a shul or a yeshiva are exempt from having a makeh guardrail on the roof. But the Gemara darshant, and we know this because the Gemara Chulin tells us that the pasuk says you have to make the makeh legagecha, to your roof, and Bate Knesses or Bate Midrashas, that excludes those roofs that belong to the community through shuls and Bate Midrash. If that's the case, is favos is the Heichal Hamikdash mechuyev makeh. Why then did the Beis Hamikdash require the makeh guardrail? The Rogatchover gives a particular explanation that the Rebbe is not satisfied with. The Rogatchover entfert them. The Rogatchover says the reason is simple. At which point is it that a person is required to put the guardrail around their roof? Like the Sifri tells us, from when you begin the process of the building, or when you initiate the construction. In other words, as soon as the house is built, even before you start to use the house, that's when you have to put up the makeh, as opposed to, let's say, a mezuzah, which you can wait until you're living in the house, and even then for a period of time. So, therefore, says the Rogatchover, the status of the Beis Hamikdash follows these halachas, which is, you build the Beis Hamikdash, and it has the status of being mundane. And once it is built, then you sanctify it to become a Beis Hamikdash. When the Mikdash wird gebaut, therefore, using the same logic, when does the makeh apply? When the building is complete. The minute the building is complete, and so it's not the minute you start the building process. When you start building the Beis Hamikdash, at that point the Beis Hamikdash is not yet holy, and therefore it requires a makeh like a house, not like a shul. In other words, the Rogatchover is making the distinction between holy places not needing a makeh and regular places needing a makeh, because the Beis Hamikdash has to initially be built in a status of chulin, and that's when the makeh obligation applies, so therefore it requires a makeh. Says the Rebbe, that Tirutz is aber tzarich iyun gadol. There's some very major questions we have to address about this particular suggestion. First of all, who said that the reason that a shul doesn't have a makeh is because it's holy? Aleph. The fact that a shul or Beis Medrash is exempt from a makeh is nit weil ze seinen kodesh, has nothing to do with their holy status, nor weil ze seinen nit gagecha, but because the Torah said you, the individual, has to own the home in order to be obligated to put up a makeh, and the Beis HaKnesses or the Beis HaMedrash is not owned by an individual. There's no person who could say it's our shul. Imagine telling that to a shul committee. Therefore, you'd think that if it's not a matter of holiness versus unholiness, but rather a matter of ownership, surely the Beis Hamikdash should be exempt from chochev ret nivne bechol, because despite the fact that the Beis Hamikdash is built in a status where it is still not yet holy, it's not your roof, it's not the roof of a group of people. Sure, it's exactly the same as a shul or a Beis Medrash. Now, don't suggest that the Rogatchover is following the thinking, the line of argument of the Rambam, which is, as Bate Knesses, Bate Midrashas, and Potter mi makeh is, the reason a shul or Beis Medrash is exempt from a makeh is, nit weil ze belang nit zu yechidim. Nothing to do with the fact that they don't have owners, but rather the nature by which they are to be used. No, because shuls and Bate Midrashas are not made for people to live in. Whereas technically the Beis Hamikdash is being built as a mundane structure, and technically you could have decided temporarily to live in the Beis Hamikdash while it's being built. Maybe that's what the Rogatchover was trying to tell us. Like the Rambam says, it's a matter of whether it's for dira or not, and as long as the Beis Hamikdash is being built, theoretically it could be used as a dira, and therefore should require a makeh. That's not a good enough explanation. Yes, we do know that practically while they're building the Beis Hamikdash, it's still choil, and only afterwards is it sanctified. But everybody knows why it's being built. It's not being built as a residential complex that will later be converted into the Beis Hamikdash. It's being built to be a Beis Hamikdash. Is mistaver, so logic says, we're not going to use, and we probably are not allowed to use the Beis Hamikdash for any personal purposes, and therefore we're back to square one. Why is it that the Rogatchover believes that the argument to support having a makeh on the Beis Hamikdash, on the Heichal, is because it's technically not holy? What has holiness got to do with it? Second question is, Beis Abayis HaMechuyev b'makeh, it's even in a normal house that needs to have a makeh, as matim denoch gemacht far Beis HaKnesses. Let's say you had a regular house, a residential house, and then you turned it into your Chabad house. So now it's a shul. Or you turned it into any other facility which is technically exempt from a makeh. The minute you turn it into a shul, you no longer have to have the makeh. I'm not saying you would dismantle it, but the chiyuv no longer applies. So if the Rogatchover's argument is you don't have to put a makeh on the Beis Hamikdash because during construction it's not yet holy, the fact that afterwards it becomes holy would mean now you don't have to put up a makeh. So we're back to square one. Why not put a makeh? Why is it that you have to put a makeh on the Heichal, on the Beis Hamikdash? So the Rebbe is going to come from a different perspective based on something that Rashi tells us, which is, Rashi is masber, it's all about the nature of the ownership. The reason why a shul or a Beis Medrash does not fall into the category of your roof is it's because the nature of a shul or a Beis Medrash is that nobody could claim sole ownership over it, because technically somebody you've never met before from many, many thousands of kilometers away could come to the shul and has free access to the shul, because that's what shuls are for. Every Jew on the entire planet. So nobody could say it's ours and have some kind of level of ownership, so it can't be called gagecha, your roof. That's why you don't have to put up a makeh. With that, Rashi explains why a shul is not like a classical building owned by a number of partners, because then you know who the partners are and they can all claim their personal gagecha, this is our roof, whereas the shul is open to every single Jew on the planet, and so nobody can say it's ours. The din is, as a bayis shel shutvin is chayav makeh. Just to clarify, if you have a building that is co-owned by different partners, you would be required to put a guardrail on that roof. Wie die Gemara sagt, like that Gemara in Chulin tells us, as chach fun vort gagecha is mashma didoch in de shutfus loy. Even though the words gagecha sound like if it's your personal property, then you have to put up the makeh, and if it belongs to you together with others, you don't. Even though that's what it sounds like from deswegen, because the Torah, and it's not always common for the Torah to do this, but here the Torah tells us a reason why you have to have a makeh, so that people don't fall off your roof. Well, if that's the issue, if we're worried about safety, what's the difference if the house is owned by 1 or 10 people? Therefore, says the Gemara, a house that belongs to different people who partner together is still required to have a makeh. A shul is not that way, because a shul is open to the broadest sense of anybody being allowed to come in. Was very So let's analyze it. Why, in fact, if the concern is about safety, why is a shul and a Beis Medrash not incorporated in the requirement to provide that safety? Surely it doesn't matter who owns the property, everybody should be safe, and we should therefore put up a makeh. Is Rashi Masbir, therefore Rashi explains. As by bought the Knesset of bottom Josh's nitov vemen to mechayivs, yes, you're right, there should be a protection on the roof, but you cannot peg the responsibility of that protection on any person, because there's nobody who you could say you're the person who is the owner of this property. The Chiyuv Makeh is if die Bailim von dem Bayis, the requirement to put a guardrail on your roof is directed at the owner of the building that's got that roof. By a Baishal Shutvin is the Chiyuv Makeh V'yedin und alle Shutvin. So if that building is owned by partners, great, then the responsibility sits with all of those partners. But when you have a group of people in a particular city who build a shul or a yeshiva, no one of those people can say, it's mine, I'm responsible for it, because this shul is also accessible to and belongs to technically every Jew in the entire world. There's no reason to single out a particular individual and say, and you're the one responsible to put up the makeh. So it's a technicality, really, according to Rashi. Es ist kein Stir nicht von dem, was man gefindt. Now you might feel that there's a contradiction from other halachas. As bei andere dinim, während die Bnei Ha'ir yofarechen wie die Bailim von der Beis HaKnesses. There are other areas of halacha where, for example, who's responsible to put the mezuzah up on a Beis Medrash? So there we say, yes, those people who run the shul or run the Beis Medrash, they're responsible for certain things. But the Chiyuv Makeh is again nit no the kinyan haguf from Beis HaKnesses. That's because here in this law, the law of the Makeh, it's not about ownership over the property. Was gehört bloß zu die Bnei Ha'ir, no euch as das is seine amokim ladur. See, the thing is this, that when you talk about a makeh, you're talking about a place that not only belongs to a particular group of people, but they also have the opportunity to, in a sense, live in that place. Right? But when you look at it from the perspective of a shul is not like a house that you can say, it's my house. I have some level of control. So I share it with a group of people. We share, 1 week each in the bungalow colony or whatever the case is. This is a shul. This is open to anybody, people you've never heard of before who come through the door. Let's go back to language that the Rogatchover himself uses. He says that the whole concept, the basis of requiring a makeh is about who lives in the place, and a shul is a place that everybody could live in, meaning to say everybody could come and use. Okay, so if we're making the distinction not between holy and unholy, but rather between whether this is a building that belongs to specific individuals who can say, we have the rights, he has the title deed, versus a building that belongs to the entire nation, where does the Beis Hamikdash fit into that? Now, you'd probably imagine, well, the Beis Hamikdash must belong to everybody. Yes, but in a different way to a shul, very different way. Now we understand why the Heichal in the Beis Hamikdash needs a makeh. Because in the Mikdash haben alle Eden gehabt a Chelek in Shutfus. Then the relationship that every single Jewish person has to the Beis Hamikdash is not like a shul. A shul is this generic open door policy for every single Jew on earth. Therefore, nobody really has ownership. The Beis Hamikdash is this massive partnership of every Jew on earth, in which case every Jew has ownership, like a whole group of people who co-own a building. Sein dem Mokem am Mikdash, was der Melech hat gekauft von Aravna Hayavussi mit dem Geld, was genommen von alle Shvatim. Number one, the plot on which the Beis Hamikdash was built was originally bought by David HaMelech by communal funds. That means the entire community, every single Shevet, bought in to that plot of land. So therefore everybody has actual title deed rights to it. And how did you build the Beis Hamikdash on that piece of land with communal funds, again, that everybody had to contribute to? In the same way as in the desert, every single Jew contributed to building the Mishkan, and you have to therefore logically assume if in the Mishkan every single Jew participated, the chances are that in the Beis Hamikdash they had a collection system that every single Jew participated in. Und Afalpi as B'shas the Yochid git seine Dove in the Kuppah is es Beifung von Yimsen Letzibur Yofe Yofe. And of course, there's no question about it. When the person gives their money, they don't expect anything in return. They don't want a proof of payment. They don't need some kind of a title deed. They're giving it with generosity. Nicht wie Mom and was gehört zu Kami Yechidem Betush Shutfus, which is very different to a whole lot of people who have collaborated in a partnership on a particular thing. Von deswegen wird durch dem nicht nisbat the government the Chel the Kayochid. So even though people are very generous and they don't expect anything in return, they still retain their particular individual rights to their contribution, and the Beis Hamikdash was built through it. And we have proof of that from a very interesting place. The proof of this is what the Moshe Rabbeinu petitions and asks Hashem when he's, so to speak, jousting with Korach and Co. That Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Eibishter, please do not accept their portion in the communal offering, indicating that every Jew has a portion, not only in the Beis Hamikdash structure, but in the running of the Beis Hamikdash and the daily routines. On the far as the Mikdash HaKol Ein Shutvus Kol Yisrael, which means that the halakhic status of the Beis Hamikdash is a building that is owned in some kind of a global partnership of every single Jew on earth, and a building that is owned through a partnership is required to have a makeh. So if every single Jew has a portion in the Beis Hamikdash, which must be the case, because every single Jew has a chelek in what goes on there, therefore the Jewish people as a collective entity had a personal responsibility to secure the safety of the roof of the Heichal by putting up a makeh, in exactly the same way as it would have been if it was 3 or 10 or 100 partners in a building. So now we know that in order for a person to be required to have to put a makeh on the roof, it doesn't have to be that it's your sole ownership. Could be that it's a joint ownership of a building, which is the status of the Beis Hamikdash. And now you are responsible to create safety, make sure people don't fall off the roof. That applies equally to the Beis Hamikdash. But there's one question though. Typically, and we've already touched on this very briefly, a house that requires a makeh has to be a place of residence. So now you'll ask the question, when do you have to put up a makeh if the house is residential? If not for that, you don't have the requirement to put up a makeh, like the Rambam says. Which is one of the reasons why shul/yeshiva is exempt from a makeh. Because those are not residential buildings. Especially from the Rambam's perspective, who says that's the make it or break it for putting up a makeh. Is it or is it not residential? Now, on the Heichel is doch nicht a Beis Dira. The Heichel of the Beis Hamikdash is certainly not a residential place. Nobody goes to sleep there or hang out there or have supper there. So how come then it requires a makeh? The fascinating explanation, it has actually to do with eating. And if you know the technicalities of the halachas of a korban, you will see that it is possible that even the heichal could sometimes accommodate the eating of certain korbanos, making it like a dira. The primary definition of a place that is dira is not just where you sleep, but where you eat. We know this from the halachas of sukkah. We know that the Torah tells us that on sukkahs we have to dwell in the sukkah, which means you got to dwell in the sukkah like you dwell in your home. So what do we primarily do in the sukkah? Primarily what we do is we eat in the sukkah. That's what indicates that we are living in the sukkah. So what do we eat in the Beis Hamikdash? The Faras Mikdash HaBeis Dira. Well, this is how we could define the Beis Hamikdash actually as a place of residence. Because the Beis Hamikdash is a place where you eat the highest level of korbanos. But you'll still say, okay, fine, you're right that there are certain korbanos that the kohanim have to eat inside the Beis Hamikdash itself, but that's not inside the heichal, the building that actually has the makeh on top. Guess what? There's a fascinating halacha that says that it is permissible under certain circumstances. There are certain circumstances where, due to extenuating circumstances, you dafka have to eat the kodesh kodashim, the most holy of all the sacrifices, dafka inside the heichal building and not in the azara, which would then qualify the heichal building as a place that deserves and is required to have the makeh on the roof. Says kinkashen neat von dem was b'shas atchak. You say, but shuls are the same, right? No, that's not a question. B'shas atchak mega talmid chochem esen eichen abeis hakneses v'kol shekein el abeis hamedrash. Shulchan Aruch says clearly that under also extenuating circumstances, a person who is totally dedicated to learning Torah is permitted to eat in a shul and certainly to eat in a yeshiva. And afal pechein werden ze nit angerufen Beis Dira kanal, and yet we still don't call a shul or a yeshiva a residence. So how come the Beis Hamikdash? Because the reason for that is because the only time we allow the Talmid Chacham to eat in the shul or in the yeshiva would be on a temporary basis. If you do something on a temporary basis, it's not going to define the halachic status of that place, because you occasionally eat there doesn't turn it into a dining room. And we see that in other areas of halacha. A sukkah is not considered a place that is real residence. That's why you don't have to put a mezuzah on it. Or if you live outside of Eretz Yisrael and you're in a house or a flat or apartment, whatever it is, a hotel room, for less than 30 days, you don't have to put up a mezuzah, because we understand that if something is temporary, it doesn't change the status of the place. But when you're talking about eating the holiest karbonos, there you're not eating because you're hungry, you're eating to fulfill a critical mitzvah that is integral to the whole of Judaism. That mitzvah upgrades the value of the eating experience. Especially when you consider that the halacha is that when you eat a carbon, you have to eat it in the richest, most luxurious way possible. That makes it something much more real and permanent. The fact that the Torah calls on us to eat karbonos in this place, even if it's only under very unique circumstances, is a beis dira that makes it a place that qualifies as a place of residence, and therefore, from that perspective, is required to have a makeh. That's the halacha of this sikha. Now we're going to analyze what the spiritual meaning of the makeh on a Beis Hamikdash, not on a shul. What's the difference? So the deeper perspective on the difference between a shul and Beis Medrash on the one hand and the Beis Hamikdash on the other with regards to having a makeh, we'll only get to explain that by first understanding, well, what does this guardrail represent in spiritual terms? The Pirush HaPnimi in Vasisa Makeh Gagecho Koimber Ki Yipal HaNoifel Mimenu is, so the deep explanation of having a guardrail lest somebody fall off the roof. What does that mean in spiritual terms? Gagecho Vaislev Hagbo V'Gaiva. Needless to say, the roof of a building is the highest point of the building, and so therefore in spiritual terms the roof represents the person who is elevated and possibly a little bit arrogant. And Vasisa Makeh Gagecho meant the fact that you have to put a protection on the roof implies, as we must summon that we've got to close up, protect, and limit the arrogance that a person has. So that nobody falls. Because arrogance is the precipitator of all spiritual downfall. As we well know, that what is it that stimulates negative behavior in a person? Egocentric awareness, arrogance. Das ist echt ihre Klolis von dem, was echt der Hegel dafür haben am Makeh. So the first thing we're going to look at, okay, so now we understand that a Makeh, you've got to have a protection against arrogance. Let's look at why you need that protection in the Beis Hamikdash, and then we'll see why maybe not in a shul. So the normal thinking that a person has is, if a house, if a place is mundane in nature, then it needs this special protection. Is which means if a person is just arrogant because they're arrogant about their business achievements or about their athletic achievements or about their intellect, okay, so that is definitely unhealthy and everybody would agree. But when you're talking about holy places, a place that is entirely holy, then even having a tinge of arrogance is also holy. Hashem, as the pasuk says, that you feel the sense of greatness because you're doing what Hashem wants. So like the Gemara tells us, as a Talmid Chacham, that a Talmid Chacham has to have 1/64 of Gaiva. Was darf man Yoba wollen? So why do you have to have a fence there? I get it. Regular arrogance, fence it in, control it, make sure that it doesn't cause damage. Holy arrogance, holy ego, that's all good. It's the hero. So therefore we have a lesson. Guess what? Even the Beis Hamikdash needs to have a makeh. As I feel it, the Gaga Hamikdash darf haben a makeh. Und noch mehr, in Mikdash Gufa, where in the Beis Hamikdash did you have to put the protection? Is the Makke given euch von Gaga Heichol und euch von dem Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holiest part of the Beis Hamikdash. That's the part that we protect. The place you'd least likely expect to need that protection. Because the lesson is that a person could be at the pinnacle of spiritual greatness. We still have to keep ourselves in check by having a very clear sense of bittul and not allowing a sense of self. Very powerful insight into a halacha, which of course we don't really relate to because it's halacha that doesn't apply today. But if you have vessels that are protected so that when they are completed, they're made in the greatest level of holiness, if you want to use them. So they're pure vessels, they'd be good for all ordinary use. But if you want to use them for something which is kodesh, for a korban, you have to first put them into a mikveh. Meaning, if a person has reached a spiritual achievement where they now feel, I am whole, I am complete. A person who has finished everything that they need to do, so to speak, in terms of their own personal purity. So it's at that point where the person feels the sense of their spiritual achievements. What's the next thing they have to focus on? Bittul. Because it's when a person has achieved great spiritual heights, that's when the tiniest morsel of arrogance could be so damaging. So that's when you need to be tefillah, you need bittul. Now, Makke Kipshut is doch nicht also verhitten sich. If you think about it, the purpose of a makkah is not really to protect yourself. The Torah makes that pretty clear. Ki yipal hanoifel, somebody else might fall off the roof. No, beikar zu bewahren, als ein zweiter soll nicht fallen von kagecha. The primary objective of the makkah is to protect another person from being the victim of your roof. Which is very relevant in spiritual terms, because the makkah legagecha is inyona, the purpose of this guardrail against arrogance, or instead to focus on bittul, is not only to protect the individual from spiraling out of control spiritually because they're so arrogant, but it's actually to protect the next person. This is such a profound lesson that a person, because of their self-assuredness, because of their ego, shouldn't cause chas v'shalom another Jewish person to fall. Let's say that there's a Jew who is engaged in spreading Judaism and looking to bring Yidden closer to Hashem. Which on a spiritual level is exactly what the Torah is talking about when it says that he has built a new house. When you build a new house, that's when you have to have the makkah. Here we're referring to a person who cannot afford to be satisfied with their own spiritual development. No, he has to build a house that's dedicated to Hashem, which means which means to build a whole environment, almost if you want, a whole melucha that is completely filled with and inspired by holiness. That's why the person is a little bit self-assured. Es ist nicht nur ein Sohn in seiner Weide Protis, no, es kann Gerem sein, an der Fehler beim zweiten, wenn man darf Maschpier sein. If at that point the person has a sense of gaiva, the damage is not just to themselves, it's to the person they're trying to bring into this world, that they're trying to uplift, that they're trying to inspire. Pshas says, Maschpier if dem Zulas mit Dvorim hayotzim en alev, onken eigene pnies chulei. Because when a person is reaching out to somebody else to inspire them in a sincere way that comes from the depths of their heart without any ulterior motives, then you can be sure you're going to hit the target and you're going to have a meaningful impact on the person. But if the person who is out there inspiring, sharing, teaching, drawing others close to Yiddishkeit, if there is a contaminant of personal arrogance, First of all, that's going to obstruct the success of getting through to the next person. But more than that, the arrogance could actually achieve the opposite of the intention. The guy in seiner Rede kann noch merachig sein dem Shemer Rachmana litzlan. That sense, that schmeck of arrogance can, instead of drawing the other person close, that could be the reason that pushes them away. And then the pasuk takes it a step further, because the person might say, but that's not my fault. If that person, it's their issue if they can't hear the truth because I happen to have a little bit of ego. Says the pasuk, that the concern over here is somebody who is going to fall. They should not fall off your roof. For Pirush Chazal, as we well know, the Pirush, that what does it mean? Ha-noifel, they were destined to fall. But Eibishter chooses his agents, good agents for good roles, and not such good agents for less happy roles. You don't want to be the person who has that roof that the person falls off. So then, Ayid can tain, and the person could say, as den viel of uns fehlt, is nicht sein Schuld. The fact that that guy got all offended because he didn't think I was as sincere as I needed to be, it's not my problem. No, but it's It's because that guy was obviously, the Eibishter decided that person's going to go on a spiritual decline. Or maybe not only are they destined, maybe they are already in a state of spiritual collapse. Because when that Zweite Welt given an Ish Yasher had that other person had integrity, given zwischen der Emeskeit von seiner Rede, then he would have had the maturity to distinguish between the truth of what I was saying, was seine Werte von Torah, then not my own ideas, that what the Torah has to say, which is truth with a capital T, und der Yeshe Shalodam, was ist in sie hereingemischt. And they should have had the maturity to distinguish between the objectively true message and the subjectively flawed human who delivered the message. Like the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir was able to take out the value of what Acher had to teach and to throw out the things that were irrelevant or inappropriate. The problem is that guy. That guy's already in a damaged spiritual state. So that's a person, because they're so spiritually susceptible, they're so spiritually vulnerable, they hear something which feels a little bit uncomfortable to them, so they throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's not my problem. Why do I have to work so hard on my arrogance, my rooftop? As der, was es schön an Eifel, soll nicht haben gar aggressive Fehler. That the other guy shouldn't collapse because of me. It's not my problem that he's in a bad way. Zogt men him. To that the Torah addresses the person and says, as nit kukendik was jener is a neufel. Regardless of the fact that the other person, the so-called recipient of your teachings, is in a bad way spiritually, liegt aber auf dem Achirv zu verhitten, as von gagecho von dein Gag, you still retain the responsibility to protect your roof, that as a result of your roof / arrogance soll nit herauskommen, euch den Fehler von a neufel. You should not be the cause of somebody falling to pieces, even if they were predestined to fall to pieces. It shouldn't be on you. Du darfst nicht sein von die, was ich selber gesagt, megalgeln chayva al yedei chayav. Don't be the negative agent. The gerem zum zweiten Nefila who causes another person to fall. If them came and so the person could still say, okay, you're right, so I'm sorry, I cannot do this job right now because I have too much arrogance, let me work on myself. The person is conscious of the fact that he still has this element of arrogance. Why get into uncharted territory? I don't know if I can really protect myself from my own arrogance effectively or not. I don't know that I'm yet in a position that I could protect myself and the other person from being hurt in the process. You know what, leave me out of it. I'm not going to build houses. I'm not going to reach out to other Jews. I'm not there yet. I've got to look after myself. I'm definitely not going to touch other people because who knows, I might contaminate them because of my arrogance. It's a pasuk makdim al sabrocha. Therefore, the pasuk says, before we get to your issues with the roof that needs to be protected, let's start with the basics. build a house. It's not only an instruction, it's a bracha as well. You've got to go and be proactive and build around you a place of holiness, a place of godliness, a place of Yiddishkeit. And you can't leave that to everybody else to do. Now, you've got to build your own brand new house of your own. Für jeden Jeden ist zugeteilt geworden ein Chelek bei was darf mevar sein und darf mechadish sein. Every single Jew has a piece of this world with their name on it. That's their responsibility to uplift and their responsibility to build. Their responsibility to turn into Hashem's home. We can't rely on all the incredible achievements of earlier generations. Nor can we rely on the great efforts of other amazing Jewish people in our generation. Each person carries the personal responsibility to construct the godliness of their corner of the world. That's your individual, unique contribution that nobody else could make. Und therefore, if you encounter another Jewish people, if you encounter another Jew, it's not accidental, that's what they wanted. The fact that you know this person means that that person's spiritual growth and development is contingent on your input. So you have no choice. You've got to start building that house. You've got to get involved. You've got to help the person. You've got to teach the person. Even if the other person is in a really bad spiritual way. And you're worried about yourself. I'm not the right candidate. I'm still too full of myself. And maybe I'll do more damage. Bei dem, was sein Ticken ist verbunden mit dem. Does it make sense that because I am imperfect, the other person should suffer, especially considering that that person is relying on me because they wish to put them and me together? They should have to wait and suffer because I'm not perfect? Macha Maike und verzamt an Yeshes. Says the Rebbe, so do something about it. Don't shrug your shoulders and say, I cannot get involved. Work on reining in the gaiva. None of us has the luxury of being able to say, sorry, this job is not for me. I don't want or cannot influence another Jewish person. There's a very famous story Chassidim tell from the Mittler Rebbe that is exactly on this point. The Mittler Rebbe hat gemacht a takona. The Mittler Rebbe set up a system with his Chassidim, as the Chassidim was vielleicht kommen kein Lubavitch, sondern auf seinem Weg zurück heim, Chazen Chassidus in der Städtlich, wo sie gehen vorbei. The Mittler Rebbe setup was, you came to visit the Rebbe, great. On your way back, you had to stop in all the little Städtlich and share the Chassidus that you had learned at the Rebbe. There was a particular individual, was für Chazen Chassidus betuf time, who did an amazing job of sharing Chassidus wherever he went. Sich verklagt, fragen mit dem Rebbe and say, comes to the Mittler Rebbe complaining. What's his complaint? As beim Chazon Chassidus, the filter Aragesh Gaiva, he was actually quite self-conscious of the fact that, I do a good job of this. And it bothered him that he's teaching the Mittler Rebbe's Chassidus, feeling good about himself. Therefore, he wanted permission from the Mittler Rebbe not to have to teach Chassidus any longer because it was making him very self-centered. Atem the Mittler Rebbe geantwortet, very famously the Mittler Rebbe answered him, if you become like an onion that has layers and layers and layers, implying of course the layers of ego that a person might collect through each success that they have, so be it, as long as you teach Chassidus. And that's the lesson over here. Yes, of course, it is critically important for us to weed out the arrogance from ourselves so we don't damage other people in the process of trying to inspire and educate them. And at the same time, we cannot use that as an excuse not to do those things until we have completely gotten rid of any vestige of arrogance from within ourselves. So that's why you have to have a makeh on the roof of your house. With that in mind, let's go back to the distinction between the Beis Hamikdash, which we've just discussed. The Beis Hamikdash is about making a home for Hashem, Kedusha, which every one of us is supposed to do, and reach out and touch other people and be very careful about how we do it, and how that's different to a shul and a Beis Medrash. Because a shul and a Beis Medrash is really the symbol of personal development, as opposed to the Beis Hamikdash, which is the symbol of helping to develop others. We can understand the difference. The union from Beis Haknesses and Medrash is A shul is all about davening, and a Beis Medrash is all about learning avodas tefillah v'limud Torah. Was das die avodah ruchnis von der Menschen in sich und mit sich? That's all about personal development. Mashenken Beis Hamikdash, Jikta is klolus avodas ha'adam, whereas the Beis Hamikdash is a much broader representation of everything that a Jewish person has to do to serve Hashem. Nit nor the avodah mit sich, not only the things that affect the individual's growth, but the primary element of the Beis Hamikdash is how do we change the world? How do we make the world a holy, godly place? How we take the physical material of this world and the world itself and turn it into Hashem's home. That's why one of the key components of the Beis Hamikdash is to bring karbonos. What is a carbon? You take the animal and the wine and the flour, which are really physical things, particularly the animal, because that represents a crass form of physicality, and you elevate it towards Hashem. And you don't just burn it on a fire. Most carbon is also shared with the kohanim. Some are even shared with the people who brought the carbon. They have to then eat the carbon and use it as a means of transforming that energy into energy that can be used to serve Hashem. It's all about elevating the world. As we know, besides the specifics of what happened in the Beis Hamikdash, the overarching theme of what the Beis Hamikdash is all about is sharing Hashem with the world. That's why the design of the transparent windows of the Beis Hamikdash was an outward-oriented design. That's in order to allow the light from within the Beis Hamikdash to illuminate the world outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and that light would then be evidence to the world that the divine presence is to be found right here. Where? In the Beis Hamikdash. Considering that the main purpose of the Beis Hamikdash is to prevent somebody who's in a bad way from falling off the roof. That's right, the Beis Hamikdash is, the Makkah is all about what? Preventing somebody who's in a bad way from falling further, as well as protecting ourselves, so we don't fall through our own arrogance. Wenn wir es vernommen mit der Avoide, was ist verbunden mit Jödet sein von der eigenen Madrigum, vernehmen sich mit Bira Oilem Tivra Beis Chodosh, that the most susceptible time, obviously, for a person to fall is when the person is reaching out and touching other people. Tivra Beis Chodosh, you're building a new home. Der Rebbe muss Beis HaKnesset, Beis HaMedrash, Ba'avechel, der Mensch is ois giton von den Yonah Oilem nicht haben kemaike. So therefore, if you're building a shul or a Beis Medrash, which is all about the person's inward focus, building themselves, you don't need the market to protect them from falling. Certainly not to protect other people from falling, because here's when you're investing in keeping yourself connected to Hashem through Torah and Tefillah. Mashenke Beis Hamikdash was tut uf in Gashmius Ha'olam, whereas the Beis Hamikdash, which is oriented towards the world, taking the physicality of this world, which obviously could entrap us. Und in Avodah Ruchnis ist das der Avodah von Boyin Abayis LaHashem machen von der Sviva Dir Lo Yisborach, which spiritually means taking the world we live in and transforming it into a world of holiness and connection. There you got to have the protection that you don't get carried away with your own arrogance and you don't harm another person by presenting as arrogant. Now you'd think, well, the best place to be is in the shul and in the Beis Medrash, where you don't have to worry about these great vulnerabilities. Turns out that the greatest experience of godliness is specifically in the Beis Hamikdash. Because it's only by engaging and elevating the world, with all the risks that entails, that we actually achieve what Hashem has in mind for creation. That's what allows us to build this new house that Hashem had, so to speak, wished for. We build the home that Hashem had a desire for. And by us building in our environment a home for Hashem, the Bayis Chodosh, we will in fact bring about the Bayis Chodosh, the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, take kef umiyad mamash.